UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg is in Riyadh to discuss revival of the political with the Yemeni government. The joint forces deter Houthi rebels' attacks in Hodeidah and inflict heavy losses among them. Angry rallies over hard living conditions continue in Aden and Hadramaut for the fifth consecutive day amid government failure to take proper action. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Roshan Fouad. The special envoy of the UN Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, arrived in Riyadh. He is expected to meet with the senior Yemeni and Saudi officials and diplomats. Grunberg will meet with Yemeni President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, Prime Minister, and representatives of Yemeni political parties. He is expected to meet also the US Special Envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking. The visit is the first for the UN envoy to the region since he took office, aiming to push for possible solutions to the conflict and end the war. In Ma'rib, the security services arrested a Houthi cell working for the Houthi militia in the city. Security sources in the special forces in Ma'rib confirmed the capture of a group working for the Houthi militia. The source confirmed that the units of the security services monitored these elements and seized explosives, tracking devices, mobile phones, and remote detonation tools that were with them, and they were planning to carry out terrorist operations in the city. In Hodeidah, a child was injured in a landmine explosion in Al-Khoukha. Local sources reported that the 8-year-old child, Sadiq Thabit Al-Uqaimi, was injured by the explosion of a Houthi mine. Medical sources stated that the child sustained various injuries and his health condition requires immediate medical treatment. This comes 2 days after 17 civilians were injured in a similar incident, most of which were women and children. In an attempt to blow up the situation in the city, Houthi militia continue shelling civilian areas and send reinforcements to the front lines, in a constant violation of the Stockholm Agreement. This report sheds light on the recent Houthi violations in Hodeidah.
Houthi militia continues to violate the Stockholm Agreement. Hais reveals the extent of the terrorism of these Irani-backed militia. Their violent attacks targeted civilian areas in the city of Hodeidah and its liberated districts.
Yesterday evening, the Houthi militia bombarded citizens' homes using mortar shells as they bombed residential areas in Beit Maghri and Hais with approximately 20 projectiles, not to mention its continuous indiscriminate shelling of civilians in other cities. This created a state of terror among civilians. From here, we send a message that the recent escalation of the militia in Hais has proven that Houthis are not committed to any agreement or ceasefire.
During the past hours, Hais witnessed a Houthi military escalation by moving reinforcements towards the front lines. The joint forces, however, thwarted the militia attempt to advance and inflicted heavy losses among them.
I send a message to all the stationed soldiers on all fronts. I also congratulate over the anniversary of the September 26th revolution. Secondly, we tell Houthis to know that they cannot confront our forces. The militia tried to bombard the citizens of Hais with artillery because they are weak, as they cowardly carry weapons in front of the citizens.
Recently, the militia launched a number of heavy artillery shells towards civilian areas in Tuhaita, Al-Jabaliyah and Al-Fazza. This led to a new displacement wave in which civilians were forced to flee, fearing from Houthi outrageous attacks. Houthi crimes against civilians continue in a constant violation of the Stockholm Agreement. Houthis seem determined to blow up the situation in Hodeidah and endanger civilians in the city amid an odd international silence about the constant violations of the militia.
In Al Bayda, government forces backed by tribes defended a Houthi attack in Al Nota front. Military sources said that Houthi attack was deterred after violent clashes and that other rebels had to flee. In El Tuhaita, 6 Houthi militants were killed and others wounded in clashes with the joint forces. A military source confirmed that Houthi rebels tried to penetrate El Faza front in Tuhaita, where they were confronted with heavy resistance from the joint forces.
In a new setback to the Houthi rebels in different fronts in Yemen, the joint forces inflicted heavy losses on the rebels in Al-Hudaydah to the west of the country. The military media of the joint forces announced that in the past few hours the joint forces tracked and spotted members of the Houthi rebels to the west of Al-Hais city. The media said Houthi mobilized new deployment to the area close to the contact lines with the joint forces. After spotting and tracking the Houthi movements in Hais, the joint forces clashed with the rebels and inflicted casualties among them. Other remaining Houthis managed to flee. The joint forces military media added that the clashes destroyed a Houthi artillery position and one of their P-10 vehicles. In Hudaydah, Houthi militia tried to penetrate the position of the joint forces that managed to control the main smuggler route south of Tuhaita. The military media said the Houthi attempt was deterred by the vigilance of the joint forces there. The rebels tried to penetrate the lines of the joint forces in Al-Faza area in Tuhaita. The penetration failed, and the rebels left behind a number of them killed and wounded. The same setback occurred to the militia in their attempt to infiltrate into joint forces position in the 16 area to the east of Hudaydah. The Houthis were confronted with fierce clashes with different types of medium and heavy weapons, causing casualties among them. Houthis lost lives too in positions between the governorates of Al-Bayda and Abyan to the center south of Yemen. The resistance forces fired mortars on the Houthi gatherings, followed by a shootout between the two sides. In Ma'rib, the strategic city, Houthis are trying in the past few days to secure again through pushing their fighter to the contact lines. The rebels try to penetrate the lines of the government forces that are backed by the tribes. A military source confirmed that the latter battled a number of Houthi penetration al-Qassara to the west of Ma'rib and caused heavy losses among them.
The tribal sheikh and a prominent leader in the resistance, Ali bin Hassan al-Shabwani, escaped an assassination attempt between Al-Abar and Ma'rib. A source close to the Shabwani family said that Sheikh Ali was coming from the Wadi' border crossing when a car exploded near his convoy on the international line between Ma'rib and Al-Abar. The source added that neither Sheikh Ali nor his companions were injured in the accident, only his car was damaged by the explosion. To Aden, where a wave of angry rallies continued in the city for the second day due to constant power cuts. Sources confirmed that demonstrators set fire in tries to cut off the main street in Krater. They protested against hard living conditions and absence of basic services, especially electricity. Demonstrators called on authorities to provide services, tackle collapse of the national currency, and pay salaries on regular basis. In Hadramaut, 2 young men were killed in Mukalla after security forces dispersed rallies over services collapse. According to local sources, 21-year-old Salim Burshan, a resident of El Sayedin neighborhood, was shot in his head while participating in protest demonstrations in Mukalla. Sources said that cities of Hadramaut are witnessing angry protests over the deterioration of basic services and living conditions in all liberated areas. The wave of protests entered its 5th consecutive day in various districts of the city. Coming next. For more than 4 years now, the issue on paid salaries is aggravating people's suffering.
أقول لك راحت بالغداء لأهلها شلت الغداء وراحت بالأهلها في المزرعة، والمزرعة ركبت على حمار ما حتى نص المزرعة وانفجر فيها اللغم، دعست على اللغم وانفجر فيهم. الحمار انتهى ما أقدر وتبقعت رجليها كامل. نغير منها نغير الشبالة اللي هي البيت سابها من دور رجليها اللي صافناها طبية أقرب طبية وصافناها لا هي بطلت رجليها كامل.
قلت أزود هلي وقابل لي لعام وطبعته تحت الزواية
Welcome back. Since Houthi rebels seized the capital Sana'a, human rights violations have been committed on a daily basis. These violations targeted all fractions of the society, including women and children. This report will shed light on the situation of the Yemeni women under Houthi rule.
Due to the ongoing armed conflict in Yemen since the end of March 2015, Yemen is undergoing a humanitarian crisis worldwide. The conflict has brought numerous accusations of violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law. The events have been brutal and have had cruel consequences on all civilians, but especially on the lives of women and young girls. Due to the tension and chaos of the crisis, combined with the deep-rooted gender inequality, conditions for women and girls in Yemen are deteriorating as the conflict drags on. Women and girls have been left vulnerable to inhuman violence, physical and psychological abuse and exploitation. The most vulnerable group of women exposed to violence in Yemen is marginalized, poor and rural women. While conditions of poverty tend to intensify forms of incidences of violence against women, rural women are also forced to carry out most agricultural work and physical labor. Thousands of Yemeni women have been at the top of the lists of victims of Houthi militia fire 6 years ago. There are many forms of Houthi violations against women, which range from deprivation of the right to work and a decent life to direct assault with murder, torture, kidnapping, and enforced disappearance, and crossed red lines after documenting cases of rape against female prisoners in the putschist detention centers. A report was issued by the National Committee to Investigate Human Rights Violations, backed by the United Nations, revealed that more than 2,000 women and girls were victims of Houthi militia fire. According to the report, the committee documented the killing and injury of 2,617 women and girls during the period from 2015 to the end of 2020, following the indiscriminate bombing that targeted residential neighborhoods in a number of Yemeni governorates. According to the National Committee, it has completed investigations into the number of 726 women who were subjected to forced displacement from their areas under arms and coercion, which led to their exposure, along with their children, to various forms of risks associated with insecurity. The National Committee pointed out that Yemeni women in Houthi-controlled areas face various types of violations, including the confiscation of their right to express opinion and demonstrate, as the Houthis have imprisoned hundreds of women in their own prisons and practiced various types of torture and violations against them. Despite the different ways in which women have been affected and suffering as a result of the conflict, Yemeni women remain strong to protect their homes, their children, and their families from the hands of the rebels.
Aden Association for Foreign Exchange directed all companies in the banking sector to start a public strike. They announced the strike will begin Wednesday in all governorates until further notice. The association revealed that the call for the strike comes in protest against the deterioration of the national currency. For almost 4 years now, state employees have been experiencing hard living conditions due to unpaid salaries. Some of them started to seek other sources of income only to be able to support their families. This report has more details on that story.
Hundreds of thousands of state employees live in a deteriorating humanitarian situation due to the suspension of their salaries since September 2016. They hope that the international organizations will reach an agreement to end their suffering, which is expirated day after day, especially with the rise in prices, housing rents, living costs, and the spread of coronavirus in the country. However, all indications showed that the political and financial division between the two sides of the conflict is still widening steadily. Until the end of 2014, there were about 1.2 million employees in the public sector in Yemen. The salaries of most of them stopped more than 3.5 years ago, which led to the inability for many of them to provide basic needs for their families. Over the past 3 years, many families have resorted to selling their savings and borrowing in the hope of a breakthrough soon. But the war has continued for more than 5 years, and the absence of any signs of peace prevented this. The salary suspension crisis began when the headquarters of the Central Bank of Yemen moved from Sana'a to Aden, the country's temporary capital. After salaries were suspended, the Yemeni government launched a project called Displaced Employees, and they are currently receiving their salaries irregularly. But this project involves only a few employees in the public sector. In Sana'a University, for example, there are only 394 academics and employees who receive their salaries within this project, out of a total of 2,400 academics and employees affiliated with the major Yemeni universities. According to the official statements for 2014, the total numbers of employees in Sana'a and the governorates is 8,100 employees compared to 4,100 others, who are located in liberated areas. State employees who are already devastated as their lives has been shattered ever since the war, and the suspension of salaries has added to their troubles. For how long the suffering of those people will continue, while the international community seems to turn blind eye to their suffering?
A week from today, the Ministry of Health will be receiving the second batch of AstraZeneca's anti-coronavirus vaccine. This was announced by the Minister of Health on Twitter. The Minister of Health said September 22 is the date set for the arrival of the second batch of AstraZeneca vaccines to Yemen, 246,400 doses. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Public Health and Population is currently implementing a vaccination campaign in the liberated governorates. The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 25 new cases of the COVID-19 in 6 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 10 cases were recorded in Hadramaut, 5 in Aden, 4 in Shabwa, 1 in Taiz, and 1 in Socotra. Also 4 deaths were recorded, plus 17 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 8,527, including 1,612 deaths and 5,305 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg is in Riyadh to discuss revival of the political with the Yemeni government. The joint forces deter Houthi rebel attacks in Hodeidah and inflict heavy losses among them. Angry rallies over hard living conditions continue in Aden and Hadramaut for the 5th consecutive day amid government failure to take proper actions. This is the end of the news. It was Roshan Fouad. See you soon.